I'm very grateful to be here with you and looking forward to sharing some ideas, but also hopefully having some give and take in the questions and answers at the end. The topic today is a fairly broad one compared to the sorts of things that I normally speak on. Normally my topics are fairly narrowly focused. This has really been an enjoyable experience to think in big terms about the future of the internet and try to put some of my thoughts in that context, and so I'm looking forward to talking through this with you today. I'll start out by talking about Windows, strangely enough, and what I've got here is screenshots of the boxes that various versions of Windows have come in since the first version of Microsoft Windows, which you see there on the top left, through Windows 95, XP, and the current version Windows 7. Software comes in these versions. Microsoft's usually releasing them every couple of years. They had to release 7 quite quickly because Vista was something of a disaster for them. But generally they put them out on a regular schedule, and with a couple of exceptions, Microsoft has referred to the first version as 1 and the third version as 3 and now the 7th version as 7 and so on. The reason for putting that up there is that people sometimes talk about the internet as if it were a piece of software and as if we were somehow on version 2.0 of the internet or of the web. People use this term Web 2.0. That is a carryover from the software world, and it implies that somehow the web is going through these discrete versions. We started out presumably with version 1.0, although nobody ever called it that, and it also implies that eventually there might be a Web 3.0 as well, or 3.1 or 2.1 or other versions in between. And of course the reality is that the web is not a piece of software released by a single company. It's a collection of networks, many websites created by millions of people around the world, and it's a very dynamic thing, a very living organism that certainly doesn't come in these neat version numbers. But people do talk about Web 2.0 as a way of describing where the web is today, and they mean certain things by that. And so that is a useful jumping off point for thinking about where we are now and how things might evolve as we move through the next few years of the internet and where it might go from here. We'll use this term Web 3.0 loosely, at least at the beginning of the presentation today. But in some ways, as I say, it's not really useful to think about the web in these terms of versions, because there will be no sudden point at which we move from Web 2.0 to 3.0. There will instead be this gradual evolution from the web as we know it today to whatever it evolves into. But let's start out with Web 2.0, because that is a term that was coined a few years ago by the O'Reilly Group and has caught on and has come to have a certain meaning. So let's at least start with that as a description of where many people think the web is today. Appropriately, I've pulled this particular short definition from Wikipedia. And Wikipedia is kind of an archetype of what people mean when they talk about Web 2.0 in a number of different ways. I won't read this whole paragraph, it's a long paragraph, but I've highlighted some of the key words here: participatory information sharing, interoperability, user-centered design, collaboration, social media, users as creators as well as consumers, social networking sites are part of it, blogs are part of it, wikis, including obviously Wikipedia, video sharing sites like YouTube and so on. These are all functions of Web 2.0. And there are some very specific definitions that you can go into in talking about what Web 2.0 is, and there are even some technical aspects to it. People talk about AJAX, which is about some of the technical stuff. That's not a single standard, it's a way of describing a set of standards for the way that some websites behave more and more like applications and less like static web pages. But in short, Web 2.0 is essentially a way of describing the current web, which is social. It's participatory, it's no longer kind of one way, people publish and other people read, but it's participatory and interactive. And it's collaborative. People work together to create things that no single person could create on their own, and Wikipedia, which I just quoted from, is an obvious example of that, but there are many other examples as well. So if you think about that as being Web 2.0, the question then becomes, what is Web 3.0, if you want to think about it in those terms? And I'm not the first person to think in these terms. Web 3.0 is a concept a lot of people have started to grapple with, think about, and try to define. And I'm going to share with you 3 brief definitions that people have postulated for what Web 3.0 might be. And then I'm going to talk about what I think about those definitions and how we can usefully move on from there. The first comes from Tim Berners-Lee, who is the creator of the World Wide Web and is now the head of the World Wide Web Standards Consortium, W3C. And he talks about Web 3.0 in terms of what he refers to as the semantic web. And I understand you may have had a presentation on this at one of your previous events. But essentially this is where machines, principally computers, can understand the natural language that's present on the web and understand it in such a way they can make sense of it and aggregate it and detect patterns and automate some of the things that would otherwise will require human interaction to make sense of it all. And so the semantic web is where suddenly semantic language is meaningful to computers. You don't have to program a computer to tell it what to do. It can simply detect the meaning in natural language and move forward from there. So the whole web becomes this sort of database that can be mined by computers in order to understand what's going on and to make meaningful decisions and move on from there. So that's one definition. It comes from Tim Berners-Lee, a very eminent figure, obviously, in the history of the web. He really does know what he's talking about. A second definition, this one comes from the software company SAP, but many people have talked about this concept of the Internet of Things, and this is where more and more physical objects have various kinds of chips embedded in them such that they become part of the internet. So it's no longer just people and websites, but various objects also being tied into the internet, and again interacting with it in an automated fashion such that there are many machines that suddenly are part of the web experience alongside ordinary users, which means the number of users expands exponentially because the number of devices per user could be 5, 10, 50. And those smart objects also start to interact with each other in meaningful ways, and suddenly it's not just users communicating with each other over the web, but machines as well. So that's the second idea, which we might describe as the Internet of Things. There's a third one. This is perhaps a more pessimistic view. This comes from a man called Andrew Keen, who wrote a book called The Great Seduction, and his whole thesis is that Web 2.0 went way too far. That essentially this sort of participatory, democratic model of the internet has created a very lowest common denominator type web, which really is never going to meet anybody's needs very well. There's no quality control. YouTube is full of cat videos and not really that useful to people, and you have to trawl through lots of trash to get to the few nuggets of gold. And that really what Web 3.0 will be about is about a return to curation and quality and the experts taking over again, essentially, and abandoning this kind of amateur hour stuff that's been going on in Web 2.0. So those are three different views of what Web 3.0 might be. The semantic web, where machines start to understand natural language and make sense of it and act on that. There's the Internet of Things, where you have various devices that start interacting with each other and become part of the web as well. And then there's this sort of dystopian view that we're going to have a return of the experts, that we're going to get away from this very democratic but chaotic form of the web that we have now and get back to something more structured, more organized, more expert, more professional, if you like. That there will be a backlash against this commons approach to the web and the return to quality, and therefore that it will reflect much more sort of broadcasting world or newspaper world rather than the sort of Wild West that we've had on the internet. So those are three competing visions. The problem with all of these is they focus very narrowly on one aspect of what the web is and how it might evolve. And the fact is that no one of these things, even if you believe in it, couldn't define the whole future of the internet. It's just each of them takes one element of what the future of the internet might look like. And the web's far too complex to be summed up in any of these ways, even though they're interesting ideas to think about, and I will come on to talking about all of them a bit more later on. But really we need to look more broadly and look at multiple themes and trends, multiple different ways in which the web will evolve in the coming years, so that we can really get a fuller picture of what's going on and what the future of the internet will look like. So one way of summarizing it is to look at some of these key points here. I've tried to keep it simple here by focusing on a few key bullets. But this is what I'll spend most of my time talking about, is talking through each of these bullet points here and what I mean by them. The web essentially over the next few years will become more social. Now obviously social was part of Web 2.0, so even more social might be another way of putting that. More personalized, more customized, if you like. It will become more mobile, by which I mean it will be accessed more and more on mobile devices that people have with them. It's no longer something that you access from a desk somewhere with a PC or a laptop, but something that you could be accessing on the train or even in a plane. More automated, and that harks back to some of the things I just talked about with semantic web and the Internet of Things. And lastly, more fragmented as well. You know, we talk about the internet as being a single thing today, but there are a number of trends happening that mean it's going to become more fragmented, it's going to be more balkanized essentially. And so you can't think about the internet as one thing anymore, you have to think about it as multiple separate domains. So I'll talk through each of these over the next few minutes, and then at the end come back and talk about what they might mean for some of you in the audience and the work that you do. So first of all, the web will be more social. And as I said, it was really a key feature of Web 2.0. So the question is even more social than it is right now. But if you think about how the web is social in the Web 2.0 world, it's mostly about having certain sites and destinations and specific applications which you go to socialize. And whether that's Facebook, whether that's Twitter, whether it's MySpace and Friendster before those, there were these social destinations, if you like, that people went, and it was a specific activity that was social networking, and you went to a particular place or a particular application to do that. The difference now is that that socialness, if you like, is being built into the whole fabric of the web. And so it's no longer just going to facebook.com or twitter.com, but it's actually about things like the like button, which are now appearing not just on Facebook itself, but on third-party websites as well, such that you can be on CNN.com, for example, and see an article that you like and click the like button, and that will then go back to Facebook. All your friends will see it, and it will appear that you've recommended to them, even though you've never visited Facebook.com during the course of that interaction. And Facebook's also, for example, got that commenting system that's being adopted by some blogs now. So again, you're on a blog website, you're not on Facebook.com, but that activity is feeding back to Facebook, and it's pulling your profile information, your identity, out of your Facebook profile and into that website to give you a meaningful presence there and tie it back into your online activity overall. And so I've used Facebook as the example here, and I'll talk a bit more about Facebook specifically in a minute, but really there are a whole range of different sites and networks which are doing this. Twitter has a tweet button which you can put on a website, and Twitter can be used to log in for comments and various other things as well, which then can appear in your Twitter feed. So Facebook's by no means the only company and website that's doing this, but it's a good example of the trend I'm talking about, where there used to be that social networking sites were a destination, and that was a specific activity that was defined and separate from the rest of the web. Now the whole web is becoming social because these features are being integrated into other websites as well. And that's happening to quite a dramatic extent, and these are some figures that came out just this past week, based on ComScore figures and a guy called Ben Elowitz who's done some analysis for his company, which is called WebPaint. But essentially he indexed web usage in terms of time spent at 100 in March of 2010, and then he's measured what happened to the social part of it, so things like Facebook and other social networking sites, and how the time spent on those things has increased over that time. And then he took the social part out and he looked at time spent on everything else online. And what he found was that there was a huge increase, 69% growth in the social part of the web, but there was actually a 9% decline in the non-social web usage. So people who were spending time on sites other than Facebook and other social networking sites, that portion of time spent actually went down over that period. So non-social web usage is actually declining in a world where web usage overall seems to be exploding. And another figure taken from his analysis is that if you exclude just Facebook from the rest of the web, consumption in terms of minutes of use shrank by nearly 9%. And that's based on ComScore numbers. And yet another way of looking at it is that Facebook's share of users' time online grew from 1 of every 13 minutes a year ago to 1 of every 8. And these are US specific figures. You could probably compile similar figures for other countries. And he is being very specific about Facebook here, because increasingly social networking is Facebook. Obviously Twitter and other sites do have some share as well, but Facebook is the dominant one in terms of where people spend their time and in terms of number of active users and so on. But social networking is becoming increasingly an important part of where people spend their time. Now, in different countries around the world, it will be different social networks. And if you look at this chart from June of 2009, these are the dominant social networks in each of the countries around the world. There are many countries in Africa where there really wasn't one to speak of. The dark blue colour here is obviously Facebook blue, so those colours, those countries are countries where Facebook is a dominant network, but you have others as well in other countries. But you go just 2 years later and all of a sudden a lot of countries that had nothing have now turned Facebook blue. Countries where there was a different social network that was dominant have turned that blue color as well. And there are fewer and fewer countries, mostly here in Asia, where there are some dominant local networks where Facebook is not the dominant network. You've got Orkut, Google's property in Brazil, but that's really an exception, whereas Facebook seems to be the rule. So although we talk about social networking and the web becoming more social in general terms, in many ways actually it's very specifically Facebook that's driving that change and Facebook that's dominating usage. So the web is more and more experienced through Facebook, and if I look at the links, the content, the videos, the pictures that I see on a day-to-day basis, and how many of those were triggered by something that I saw in my Facebook stream, that's more and more a part of where I consume my content. So whether it's somebody posting a YouTube video or a personal photo or video of themselves or their family, or a link to an interesting article that they read, and even when I'm on third-party sites, I'm seeing a stream of things that my friends have recommended and liked on those pages as well. So the web is more and more experienced through Facebook, and as that statistic I showed just now said, 1 in 8 minutes is now spent on Facebook. And that ignores other sites where Facebook is integrated. So that's more social, and that's where the socialness, if you like, is built into more and more websites aside from the social networking sites themselves. Secondly, the web will be more personalized, more customized. It'll be a unique experience that you have on the web that will not be exactly like the experience anybody else has. Some examples of that. This is quite small print here, but this is just a screenshot from Google's website, where they describe the process by which they personalize your search results. How many of you are aware that Google personalizes your search results, so that you don't see the same search results as everybody else does? Okay, a few of you are, but not everybody, certainly. This is a detailed description of how they do it. They do it because you're usually logged in because you've been using Gmail or another Google service, and so when you go to Google search, they still know who you are. They have a history, unless you've turned it off, of your web searches from the past, and they know which links you clicked on and so on. But they also use a range of other factors as well, and even if you're not signed in, they still know which browser you're using, which country you're in, which version of the browser you're using, what kind of computer you're using, whether it's a Windows PC or a Mac, and they use that to tailor the results that you get, so that the results that you may get on Google will be quite different from the results that somebody else would get, even if you're doing exactly the same search. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. Another example is Facebook, talking about that again. If you haven't logged into Facebook in a while, and this text again is taken from facebook.com's blog, but essentially if you log into Facebook, you'll see two options at the top, and one of them is everything and the other one is called top news, and that's where Facebook has pulled out the things it thinks you will find most interesting based on what the most of your friends have clicked on, based on what you've clicked on in the past, and so on. And so you get kind of a curated list that is by no means everything that's been happening since you last logged in, and it'll be quite a different list from if you just look at all, which is the other option on that front page when you log in. And so they are making decisions for you about what you will see there. This is a screenshot from Amazon. This is related to items you viewed at the top. This is new for you, so another sort of recommendations. And this is, things that you've looked at before, and suggesting you get something that you have searched for before that perhaps you didn't quite want to spring for at the time. But again, this is very personalized. If any of you logged in, you get very different results from what I got here. They're not perfect results. I happen to be looking for a picture of a R2-D2 for a presentation I gave yesterday, and that's why it's suddenly recommending me lots of R2-D2 things here on the top. So not the best recommendation, because I'm not actually that interested in it, having done that presentation now. TV shows I might be interested based on other TV shows I've watched on Amazon and various other bits and pieces here at the bottom. But again, this is personalized and customized, and Amazon's been doing this for a long time. This is a press release from Microsoft about their Bing search engine, where they have started to integrate Facebook results. Notice a pattern here, Facebook keeps coming up everywhere. But started to integrate Facebook profiles and your friends and what they have searched for and clicked on, and started to bring that into your search results as well. So by signing into Facebook before you do a Bing search, you get a different set of results from if you were just searching Bing.com logged out. So you could look at this very positively. Increased relevancy means I get to find what I want faster. Whether it's Google, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Amazon, these sites are all learning about me and serving up things that ought to be more suited to my needs, more relevant, and should get me to what I'm really looking for faster. So that's the positive side. That's a nice way of looking at it. There's a book that's come out recently. You may have heard about this. The guy on the right, his name is Eli Pariser, and he was involved in founding an organization called MoveOn.org, which is a progressive or liberal or left-wing, depending on which terminology you prefer to use, a website based here in the US that mobilizes people around political causes and so on, was very influential in the last presidential election. He's gone on to write this book about what he calls the filter bubble, and he's essentially leading a backlash against all this personalization and saying that because all of this personalization is happening, things are being shielded from your view that you otherwise would see, because companies like Google and Facebook and so on think they know better than you do what you should be interested in. And so they start shielding you from things, and it reinforces itself. So the more that you click on the links they serve up, the more it customizes those search results and so on. And so you get a narrower and narrower field of view, and you end up having this sort of living in a filter bubble, as he calls it, where you don't see the whole world, you just see the slice that these various companies have decided you ought to see based on your past behavior and your stated interests and so on. So it's a book that's just come out. He's been doing interviews all over the place. Some of the things that he has talked about is, Eric Schmidt, who's chairman of Google now, having stepped down as CEO recently, has said it will be very hard for people to consume something that has not, in some sense, been tailored for them. It's a very straightforward admission on the behalf of Google, saying that essentially it's all going to be tailored. There's no way you're going to get a pure, unfiltered result anymore. It's pretty much impossible to do. But the author of the book gives some examples where he had several of his friends search for the exact same term on Google and see what results came up. And in this particular case, he had his friend Caitlin search for BP, meaning British Petroleum, the big oil company, and he had his friend Julia search for BP. Now, he doesn't go into the details in terms of what the background is here, but essentially Caitlin may have been somebody who's more socially involved, more interested in the news, more interested in causes and so on. And so many of the results she gets are about the big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico that happened a few months ago, news results around that, BP's official response and so on and so forth. Whereas Julia over here perhaps hadn't been as interested in those things, or at least hadn't demonstrated that interest through past behavior on Google. And so Julia's results are all official BP websites, like investor information and other things like that. And so very different set of results, where here you wouldn't even know that BP had had a major oil spill, and over here it's dominated by the oil spill and the news and other sites about that. And so those are very real examples that he picked from his own friends who he had do some test searches. So that personalization, as I say, has positive aspects, but also potentially negative aspects, and there's starting to be a backlash against them. And I'll talk about some of the negative aspects from a marketing point of view later as well. Thirdly, the web will be more mobile. So more and more accessed on mobile devices and so on and so forth. And mobile devices doesn't just mean mobile phones either. There's an increasing proliferation of connected devices that people use. And so this data comes from our consumer survey, which is across 9 countries, several in Europe, the US, and some emerging markets countries as well, India among them. But we said, which of the following devices do you have that is connected to the internet? So this is not, do you have a hi-fi music system, which otherwise would seem very low, but it is, do you have one that's connected in some way to the internet? And what you see is, desktop and laptop are very high. That's been the main device people use to access the internet. But even across these 9 countries, which includes some where mobile internet is still relatively new, that mobile phone number is very high. It's almost 40%. And if you went to some of the European countries or here in North America, you see that number much higher. But also games consoles, portable games consoles, television set-top boxes, specific devices like iPod touches and iPads, but also various other bits and pieces here as well. And what you can see is this is a very wide range of devices now that's connecting to the network, and many of those are mobile. Mobile phones, obviously, laptops, portable games consoles, iPod touches, iPads, other portable media devices, other tablets, and so on. So many, many devices that are connecting to the network, and this is now the primary way that many people are consuming the web. And the problem with that is that they don't necessarily consume it through a web browser anymore, but they may well be consuming it through mobile applications downloaded from the Apple App Store, from Android Market, or other stores. So then they're now getting a front end that is very much managed and curated and filtered again, and is not the open web. And so they're not being exposed to web advertising, they're not being exposed to the fullness of the web, but rather a very narrow slice of it, which is good for them, but makes the whole question of how you reach those users quite different. In addition to the proliferation of different kinds of devices, people also are owning more and more different devices that they're communicating on and accessing the web on. So, a relatively small number of people, about a third of our sample, had only one device that they regularly connected to the internet, but about the same number had two, and significant numbers had 3, 4, 5, and the bar doesn't disappear even when you get to 15 devices here. So there are people with over a dozen devices that they connect to the network. And if I think about my home, we have multiple phones, we have an iPad, we have set-top boxes which are connected to the internet, and we also have third-party boxes that are connected to our televisions. We have multiple PCs, we have network printers, and so on. It's easy to imagine how you get up to quite a few devices on a question like this. But it's that proliferation of devices that means people's web experience is very much not anymore just a PC or laptop experience, but much more diverse than that. The other thing is that people are doing some of the same activities that they've always done, but they're now shifting those to mobile. And again, I think this is skewed lower by the fact that we've got a number of emerging markets countries, but listening to music, the blue bars are what people do on mobile phones, the red bars are what people do on PC or laptop. Listening to music, accessing social networks, email, news, games, internet searching, online banking, and so on. And those numbers are rising. I mean, this is a survey that we do every year now, and we're seeing those numbers just going up and up, and again, in the more developed markets, the numbers are even higher. So very much a strong growth in mobile activity around some of these things. And for Twitter and Facebook, for example, a very large chunk of their usage now comes from mobile applications and from the mobile versions of their websites rather than from their full desktop versions of their sites. And what's driving that, in part at least, is smartphone adoption. So if people have a device that's very capable, that can run applications, that can run a full web browser, that makes a huge difference. And so this is our forecast for smartphone shipments. So this isn't the number of people that have one, this is how many devices are sold in a given year. But it gives you an idea of how fast that's growing. And obviously in North America, Asia Pacific and Europe, very high penetration of smartphones, very high number of shipments. But even in Middle East and Africa and South and Central America, it's growing quite rapidly there as well, because smartphones are coming down in price. The plans that operators attach to them are also coming down in price, and so they're becoming more and more accessible to more and more of the population. So that's driving that mobile usage. And we've reached a tipping point recently, and then this is another set of data that came out recently from a company called Flurry that does web analytics. And they have been tracking over time the number of minutes that people spend per day browsing the web versus using mobile applications. And if you went back a year or so, the web was still about 50% bigger than the time spent on mobile applications. If you go back 6 months, they're starting to become pretty even, and in the most recent set of numbers, mobile application usage has actually taken over from time spent just browsing the regular web. And that will continue to grow, that shift will continue to happen. So more and more the way people consume the web is through mobile devices, and specifically through mobile applications rather than a web browser.